You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Friday evening, folks. Happy end of your busy work week. And welcome to my program. This is Scotty Roberts. This is the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to go on over and take a look at all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you could be watching this in its simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel, along with the live chat room with the other fellow Intrepids that are in there right now, starting to talk up a storm about this show and probably many other things. So come on over and join us if you'd like to watch this in video, and join the chat room over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we've been, as you know, if you're a new listener tonight, we've been in a very long series for the last 4 to 5 weeks on Native America and the taking of the American West and the conquering of the American West by the United States over the Native American population that was here, that owned the land here, and how we took the land away, how we wiped them out, how we drove them onto reservations, and a pretty ugly blot on American history. And you can read more about this. Go get D. Brown's book, the late D. Brown, D-E-E, D. Brown. You can pick up his book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And you can find this book almost anywhere. I read it for the first time maybe 25 years ago. And it really changed my personal outlook on the taking of the American West. It was also always known as the winning of the West. We moved west, we fought with the Indians, and we ended up winning, and we gained the land, and we never really thought about the details of what took place. And the history, of course, is written by the victors. So this is a history that was written by the Native American, and in a Native American perspective, of the stealing of the American West, of the atrocities committed by the United States against the Native American peoples, and the driving them onto the reservations, and the treaties that were made, and all of them broken and written over and over and over again. And those reservations still exist today, and there are treaties that still exist today that have been so watered down from their original intent. This particular episode that we're talking about the Black Hills and the taking of the Black Hills, the war for the Black Hills and the Dakotas. And this, of course, is with the Oglala Sioux and the other Sioux tribes, and how in 1868 there was a treaty written, and President Ulysses S. Grant, former general, President Grant had promised them that land would be theirs in perpetuity, and that no whites could cross over into that territory without repercussions legally from the United States, or really, in fact, endangering themselves with the tribes that lived there, without permission, is the way that was put. And once, 4 years later, they discovered gold in the hills, the Black Hills, white settlers by the thousands started moving into that area, and the Indians were driving them off. Some of them they killed, and it all depended on what kind of confrontation they have. And they appealed to the Indian agent, and they said, look, this is our land by treaty. Your people are coming in here at their own, and they're not asking our permission. And so what happened now? Because there's gold there, the President of the United States, the head of the Indian Bureau, head of Indian Affairs, and all the different politicos all the way down the line were pushing to have this land. And they were trying to rewrite the treaty so they could take the land in exchange for something else. The Indians, they were on to them by now, and they said, no, absolutely not. And so they came back and tried to compromise. Said, will you give our people permission? And when they're done mining gold, they'll move out of your area. And they still said flatly, no. As a matter of fact, some of the main chiefs that they needed to have come to this treaty restructuring, Red Cloud, he didn't even show up for the meeting. Spotted Tail spoke for all the Sioux at this meeting, and he rejected all the officers firmly. The Black Hills are not for sale, is what they told the U.S. government. And so the commissioners, they all packed up. They returned to Washington, D.C. They reported their failure to persuade the Sioux to relinquish the Black Hills and recommended that Congress disregard the wishes of the Indians and appropriate a sum fixed, quote, as a fair equivalent of the Black Hills, of the value of the Black Hills, end quote. And this forced purchase of the Black Hills should be presented to the Indians as a finality, they said. Now, keep in mind, there was one mine alone in the Black Hills that yielded $500 million worth of gold in the 1870s by the value of $1. And so that lets you know how much gold was in the Black Hills. And the Indians, they weren't so much into that, but they said, you give us a fair price. And then finally, after they found out they're trying to be swindled out of that land, they just said, no, all offers are off the table, and they went away. Now, this rejection prompted the U.S. government to say, you present this as a finality. Here is what we will give you in exchange for the Black Hills. And what this finality meant, folks, was it meant you will accept this, or there will be bad alternatives for you, Native American people. And this set in motion a whole chain of events. And this chain of events culminated in the greatest defeat ever of the United States Army at the Greasy Grass, at the Little Bighorn. This is the culmination of all of this. And so now, you ever wonder what happened with Custer and the Black Hills and so on? It was Custer who first brought the news back a few years earlier. There was gold everywhere. He said from the grassroots and down, all over the Black Hills. And that's when people started moving in. So all this wanting to move the Indians off of their sacred hills was all because of gold. And now the United States is going to go to war with the Indians if they don't accept their offer. And they're going to forcibly drive them off the land. And it culminated in the greatest defeat that was ever suffered by the United States at the hands of the American Indian. And ultimately, this would destroy forever, conversely, the freedom of the Northern Plains Indians. That would be the final outcome of the Little Bighorn. Now, we saw this yesterday we talked about this whole line of events from November 9th of 1875 through, what was the final date? February 8th of 1876. Over the next 2.5 to 3 months, this went all through Washington. By February 8th of 1876, General Sheridan ordered Generals Crook and Terry to begin preparations for military operations in the direction of the headwaters of the Powder, Tongue, Rosebud, and Bighorn rivers, where Crazy Horse and his allies frequented. And once this machinery of government began moving and the military was put into place here, it became an inexorable force. It was mindless. It was uncontrollable. And runners went out from the agencies late in December to warn the non-agency chiefs to come in. Heavy snows prevented this. Blizzards. And even if the hostiles, quote unquote, had made it to the agencies and the reservations, they would have starved there because there would have been no supplies coming in. So in January, a courier found Sitting Bull camped near the mouth of the Powder River. And the Hunkpapa chief said the messenger, he sent him back to the agent. And he informed him that he'd consider the order to come in, but couldn't even do so until the grass was green, or the moon of the green grass. And Crazy Horses Oglalas were in winter camp near Bear Butte, B-U-T-T-E. But, if you want to say it that way, Bear Butte, where the Thieves' Road came into the Black Hills from the north. And during the spring, it would be a good place to make up raiding parties to go against the miners violating their Black Hills, Pahasapa, the sacred spot of the earth. the sacred center of the earth to the Oglala. And so when agency couriers made their way through the snow to Crazy Horse, he told them politely that he could not come until the cold went away. Quote, "It was very cold," a young Oglala remembered afterward, "and many of our people and ponies would have died in the snow. Also, we were in our own country, and we were doing no harm." And so the January 31st ultimatum was a little short of a declaration of war against the independent Indians, and many of them accepted it as that. But they didn't expect the Bluecoats to strike so soon. In the moon of the snow blind, that would be February, 3 Stars Crook came marching north from Fort Fetterman along the old Bozeman Road, where 10 years before Red Cloud had begun his stubborn fight to keep the Powder River country inviolate. Now, by the way, grew up and lived in Minnesota most of my life. Now I'm in western Wisconsin. I'm just across the river from Minnesota. As I've said before, kind of in the extended outreaches of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, which is about a half an hour drive from my house. And in Minnesota, we always get the Dakota weather. Most of our weather comes from the west-northwest. It comes out of Canada, it comes sweeping down out of the northwest, and it brushes across the Dakotas. And so weather that takes place in the Dakotas hits us usually the next day or two. And so I only say this to say, when there were blinding blizzards in February, and it's called the moon of the blinding snow, February, you can start to have thaws in Minnesota and the Dakotas, and sometimes you get up into the 40 degrees after a below zero weather in our region. But then you can be hit by these cold blasts that come out of Canada and cross the Dakotas and into Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so I assure you, in February, when it's called the moon of the blinding snow, that's exactly what it can be in February in the Dakotas. So about this time, a mixed band of Northern Cheyenne and Oglala Sioux left Red Cloud Agency to go to the Powder River country, where they hoped to find a few buffalo and antelope. About the middle of March, they joined some non-agency Indians camped a few miles from where the Little Powder runs into the Powder. And Two Moon, Little Wolf, Old Bear, Maple Tree, and White Bull were the Cheyenne leaders. Low Dog was the Oglala chief, and some of the warriors with him were from Crazy Horse's village farther north. Pardon me for my lack of cough button and trying to clear my throat. So, without warning, at dawn on March 17th, Crook's advance column under Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds attacked this peaceful camp. Now, fearing nothing in their own country, the Indians were sleeping when Captain James Egan's White Horse Troop formed in a company front and dashed into the teepee village, firing pistols and carbines, and at the same time, a second troop of cavalrymen came in on the left flank, and a third swept away the Indians' horse herd. So the first reaction from the warriors was to get as many women and children as possible out of the way of the soldiers, who were firing recklessly in all directions. And now old people trotted and hobbled away to get out of reach of the bullets, singing among all the lodges, Wooden Legs said afterward. Braves seized whatever weapons they had and tried to meet the attack. Now, as soon as the non-combatants were started up a rugged mountain slope, the warriors took positions on ledges or behind huge rocks, and from these places they held the soldiers at bay until the women and the children could escape across the Powder River. Now, from a distance, this is a quote, "From a distance, we saw the destruction of our village," Wooden Legs said. "Our teepees were all burned with everything in them. I had nothing left but the clothing I had on." And by the way, March 17th, that is now St. Paddy's Day. You get St. Paddy's Day up here. Sometimes it's 20 below zero, sometimes it's 60 degrees outside. It all depends on the winter. So it's still cold outside. So as soon as the non-combatants were up the slope, the warriors took their positions and they watched their village being burned. The Bluecoats destroyed all the pemmican and the saddles in the camp, and they drove away almost every pony the Indians owned. So between 12 and 1,500 head. So as soon as the darkness fell, the warriors went back to where the Bluecoats were camped, determined to recover their stolen horses. And Two Moons succinctly described what happened. He said, "That night, the soldiers slept, leaving the horses to one side. So we crept up and stole them back again, and then went away." That was Two Moon, and this is in General Custer's Last Fight as Seen by Two Moon. It was published in McClure's magazine in 1898, written by Harlan Garland. So this was Two Moon's account of what happened. So Three Stars Crook was so angry at Colonel Reynolds for allowing the Indians to escape from their village and recover their horses that he ordered him court-martialed. He's court-martialed because he didn't kill them all. The army reported this foray as the attack on Crazy Horse's village, but Crazy Horse himself was actually camped miles away to the northeast. You see how these things are done. And just compare that to what we hear in modern military terms. By the way, there are some secrets that need to be kept from the public, but sometimes what you hear isn't always what happened. Now, that was where Two Moon and the other chiefs had their homeless people in hopes of finding food and shelter. They were more than 3 days making the journey. The temperature was below zero at night, and only a few had buffalo robes, and there was very little food. Imagine going outside. Now, sorry, my voice is just cloudy today. I live up here. I grew up here, so when it's 20 below, I'll sometimes go out, and if I'm sitting around the house in shorts and a t-shirt, I'll put on my tennis shoes and I'll walk the trash out, and it's 20 below. It's cold, but you're used to it. And these people, they lived out in the open, and they were definitely used to this weather. But still, trying to travel, trying to save your people, trying to do what it took to get away from the army was all something that was being done while it's below zero at night. And trust me, even if you're used to it, that's cold. So Crazy Horse received the fugitives hospitably. He gave them food and robes. He found room for them in the Oglala teepees. "I'm glad you are come," he said to Two Moon after listening to accounts of the Bluecoats plundering the village. "We're going to fight the white man again." "All right," Two Moon replied. "I'm ready to fight. I've fought already. My people have been killed, my horses stolen, my village destroyed. I'm satisfied to fight." And this was all, of course, it's a part of the book I just or the magazine article that was written in 1898 of his account of remembering all of this. And this is about 20 years later this article was written, and he was asked these questions. So in Geese-laying Moon, when the grass was tall and the horses were strong, Crazy Horse broke camp and led the Oglalas and the Cheyenne north to the mouth of the Tongue River, where Sitting Bull and the Hunkpapas had been living through the winter. Not long after that, Lame Deer arrived with a band of Minneconjou and asked permission to camp nearby. They had heard about all the Bluecoats marching through the Sioux hunting grounds and wanted to be near Sitting Bull's powerful band of Hunkpapas, should there be any trouble. As the weather warmed, the tribes began moving northward in search of wild game and fresh grass. Along the way, they were joined by bands of Brule, Sanarks, Blackfoot Sioux, and additional Cheyenne. And most of these Indians had left their reservations in accordance with their treaty rights as hunters, and those who had heard of the January 31st ultimatum either considered it only as another idle threat of the Great Father's agents or didn't believe it applied to peaceful Indians like them. And so many young men were anxious to go for fighting the soldiers. said the Cheyenne warrior, Wooden Leg. But chiefs and old men all urged us to keep away from the white men. And this quote is something that was part of that Marquis magazine article in 1898. And so, while these several thousand Indians were camped on the Rosebud River, many young warriors joined them from the reservations. Many young warriors came in. They brought rumors of great forces of bluecoats marching from 3 directions. 3 Stars Crook was coming from the south. The one who limps, that's Colonel John Gibbon, was coming from the west. 1 Star Terry and Long-Hair Custer were coming out of the east. So early in the moon of making fat, the Hunkpapas had their annual sun dance. For 3 days, Sitting Bull danced, bled himself, and stared at the sun until he fell into a trance. When he rose again, he spoke to his people. In his vision, he had heard a voice crying this, quote, "I give you these because they have no ears." When he looked into the sky, he saw soldiers falling like grasshoppers, with their heads down and their hats falling off. They were falling right into the Indian camp, because the white men had no ears and would not listen. Wakantanka, the Great Spirit, was giving these soldiers to the Indians to be killed. Now that is that quote, by the way, and that idea is coming from Sitting Bull, Champion of the Sioux. It was a book written by Stanley Vestal, and it's the University of Oklahoma Press from 1957. And a few days later, a hunting party of Cheyenne sighted a column of bluecoats camped for the night at the Valley of the Rosebud. The hunters rode back to camp, sounding the wolf howl of danger. 3 Stars was coming, and he had employed mercenary Crow and Shoshones to scout ahead of his troops. So the different chiefs sent criers throughout the villages and then held hasty councils. It was decided to leave about half the warriors to protect the villages, while the others would travel through the night and attack 3 Stars soldiers the next morning. About 1,000 Sioux and Cheyenne formed the party. A few women went along to help with the spare horses. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Two Moon were among the leaders of this band. And just before daylight, they unsaddled and rested for a while, and when they turned away from the river and rode across the hills, 3 Stars Crow scouts had told them of a great Sioux village down the Rosebud, and the generals started these mercenaries out early in the morning. As the Crows rode over the crest of the hill and started down, they ran into the Sioux and the Cheyenne warriors. At first, the Sioux and Cheyennes chased the Crows in all directions, but bluecoats began coming up fast, and the war All right, gang, thanks for holding on this Friday night. Welcome back to the second segment of tonight's broadcast. You're listening to me, Scotty Roberts, and the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to come on over and look at all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. Find all the outlets that you can for this show and where to listen to archives of this show. And so you can also come on over right now, join the live chat room that's going on over on the YouTube channel. Join the other Intrepids there. Join in the conversation about this show and many other things that they all talk about at the same time. So come on over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts and join the fun over there. Now, we left off, and I want to jump right back into this, that it was Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and who was the other chief that I had mentioned? Sitting Bull, they rode out to Wooden Leg, and they rode out to meet this Blue Coat troop. They wanted to attack them. They wanted to test them. They wanted to see what they were made of, because they're now in their territory. And for a long time, Crazy Horse had been waiting for a chance to test himself in battle with the Bluecoats. Now he's there. And they run into this band of Native American, the Shoshone, and some of the Crow that were allied with the Bluecoats because they were enemies of the Sioux. And so they all bump into each other now early in the morning. They had gone out to do some reconnaissance, and they run into Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull's band here of about 1,000 warriors. And so in all the years since the Fetterman fight at Fort Phil Kearny, he had studied the soldiers and their ways of fighting. And each time he went into the Black Hills to seek visions, he had asked Wakantanka, the Great Spirit, to give him secret powers, so that he would know how to lead the Oglalas to victory if the white men ever came again to make war upon his people. And since the time of his youth, Crazy Horse had known that the world that men lived in was only a shadow of the real world. This was his spirituality. And to get into the real world, he had to dream. And when he was in the real world, everything seemed to float or dance. And in this real world, his horse danced as if it was wild or crazy. And this is why he called himself Crazy Horse. He had learned that if he dreamed himself into the real world before going into a fight, he could endure everything. Think back to some of the episodes where we've talked about being awake, being aware, living in the dream world. And sometimes, remember we talked about dreams, how our dreams are the real world speaking to us as we live in the shadow world. This is very consistent with what Crazy Horse experienced in his own spirituality. And so on this day, June 17th of 1876, now, keep this date in mind. This is June 17th. Custer's last stand in the Battle of the Little Bighorn took place only 8 days later. So this is June 17th, 1876. Crazy Horse dreamed himself into the real world, and he showed the Sioux how to do many things they had never done before while fighting the white man's soldiers. When Crook sent his pony soldiers in mounted charges, instead of rushing forward into the fire of their carbines, the Sioux faded off to their flanks and struck weak points in their lines. Crazy Horse kept his warriors mounted and always moved from one place to another. By the time the sun was in the top of the sky, he had the soldiers all mixed up in 3 separate fights. The Bluecoats were accustomed to forming skirmish lines and strong fronts, and when Crazy Horse prevented them from fighting like that, they were thrown into confusion. So by making many darting charges on their swift ponies, the Sioux kept the soldiers apart, always on the defensive, not the offensive, and when the Bluecoats' fire grew too hot, the Sioux would draw away, tantalize a few soldiers into pursuit, and then turn on them with a fury. The Cheyenne also distinguished themselves that day, especially in the dangerous charges. Chief Comes in Sight was the bravest of all. But as he was swinging his horse about after a charge into the soldier's flank, the animal was shot down in front of a blue-coat infantry line. Suddenly another horse and rider galloped out from the Cheyennes' position and swerved to shield Chief Comes in Sight from the soldiers' fire. In a moment, Chief Comes in Sight was up behind the rider. The rescuer was his sister, Buffalo Calf Road Woman, who had come along to help with the horse herds. That was why the Cheyennes always remembered this fight as the battle where the girl saved her brother. The white men called it the Battle of the Rosebud. Now, when the sun went down, the fighting ended. The Indians knew they had given 3 Stars a good fight, but they did not know until the next morning that they had whipped him. At first daylight, Sioux and Cheyenne scouts went out along the ridges, and they could see the Bluecoat column retreating far away to the south. General Crook was returning to his base camp on Goose Creek to await reinforcements or a message from Gibbon, Terry, or Custer. And the Indians on the Rosebud were too strong for one column of soldiers. So after the fight of the Rosebud, the chiefs decided to move west to the valley of the Greasy Grass, the Little Bighorn. Scouts had come in with reports of great herds of antelope that were west out there, and they said that the grass for the horses was plentiful on the nearby benchlands, and soon the camp circles were spread along the west bank of the twisting Greasy Grass for almost 3 miles. 3-mile-long Indian camp. No one knew for certain how many Indians were there, but the number could not have been smaller than 10,000 people, including 3,000 or 4,000 warriors. It was a very big village, and you could hardly count the teepees, Black Elk had said on his recollections of this village. Farthest upstream toward the south was the Hunkpapa camp, with the Blackfoot Sioux nearby. The Hunkpapas always camped at the entrance or the head end of the circle, which was the meaning of their name. So below them were the San Arcs, the Minneconjou, the Oglala, and the Brule, and at the north end were the Cheyenne. And the time was early in the moon when the chokecherries are ripe, with days hot enough for boys to swim in the melted snow water of the Greasy Grass. Hunting parties were coming in and going in the direction of the Bighorns, where they had found a few buffalo as well as antelope. The women were digging wild turnips out of the prairies. Every night, one or more of the tribal circles held dances, and some of the nights the chiefs met in councils. Quote, "The chiefs of the different tribes met together as equals," Wooden Legs said. There was only one who was considered as still being above all the others. This was Sitting Bull. He was recognized as the one old man chief of all the camps combined. Now Sitting Bull did not believe the victory on the Rosebud had fulfilled his prophecy of soldiers falling into the Indian camp. So since the retreat of the 3 Stars, however, no hunting parties had sighted any bluecoats between the Powder and the Bighorn. Sitting Bull knew something was coming. They did not know until the morning of June 24th, 1876, that Long-Hair Custer was prowling along the Rosebud. Next morning, scouts reported that the soldiers had crossed the last high ridge between the Rosebud and the Indian camp, and they were marching toward the Little Bighorn. The news of Custer's approach came to the Indians in various ways. Red Horse said, "I and 4 women were a short distance from the camp digging wild turnips." And suddenly one of the women attracted my attention into a cloud of dust rising a short distance from the camp. I soon saw that the soldiers were charging the camp. To the camp I and the women ran. When I arrived, a person told me to hurry to the council lodge. The soldiers charged so quickly that we could not talk. We came out of the council lodge and talked in all directions. The Sioux mount horses, take guns, and go fight the soldiers. Women and children mount horses and go, meaning get out of the way. And this is a quote that was part of the U.S. Bureau of American Ethnology, their annual report, the 19th one of them, in 1888. Now, Pete Sanwastewin, a cousin of Sitting Bull, was one of the young women digging turnips that morning. She said that the soldiers were 6 to 8 miles distant when they first sighted them. We could see the flashing of their sabers and saw that there were very many soldiers in the party. The soldiers first seen by Patatsen, Wastewin, and other Indians in the middle of the camp were those in Custer's battalion. Now, these Indians weren't aware of Major Marcus Reno's surprise attack against the south end of the camp until they heard rifle fire from the direction of the Blackfoot Sioux lodges. Like that, the soldiers were upon us. Through the teepee poles, their bullets rattled. The women and the children cried, fearing they'd be killed, but the men, the Hunkpapa and Blackfeet and Oglala and Minneconjou, mounted their horses and raced to the Blackfoot teepees. We could still see the soldiers of long hair marching along in the distance and our men taken by surprise, and from a point whence they had not expected to be attacked, went singing the song of battle into the fight behind the Blackfoot village. And this was from James McLaughlin's book, My Friend the Indians, written in 1910. Now, Black Elk was a 13-year-old Oglala boy, and he was swimming with his companions in the Little Bighorn. The sun was straight above, and it was getting very hot when he heard a crier shouting in the Hunkpapa camp, "The Chargers are coming! They are charging! The Chargers are coming!" The warning was repeated by an Oglala crier, and Black Elk could hear the cry going from camp to camp northward to the Cheyenne. Low Dog, an Oglala chief, heard this same warning cry. "I did not believe it. I thought it was a false alarm. I did not think it possible that any white man would attack us, so strong as we were. Although I did not believe it was a true alarm, I lost no time getting ready. When I got my gun and came out of my lodge, the attack had begun at the end of the camp where Sitting Bull and the Hunkpapas were." Now, Iron Thunder was in the Minneconjou camp. I didn't know anything about Reno's attack until his men were so close that the bullets went through the camp. And everything was in confusion. The horses were so frightened we couldn't catch them. Crow King, who was in the Hunkpapa camp, said that Reno's pony soldiers commenced firing at about 400 yards distant. And the Hunkpapas and the Blackfoot Sioux retreated slowly on foot to give the women and children time to go to a place of safety. Other Indians got our horses, and by the time we had warriors enough to turn upon the whites. So near the Cheyenne camp, now folks, listen to this. This is, in a sense, this is very exciting. This is the build-up to the big battle that we're all so familiar hearing about. So near the Cheyenne camp, 3 miles to the north, Two Moon was watering his horses. I washed them off with cool water, then I took a swim myself. I came back to the camp afoot. When I got near my lodge, I looked up the Little Bighorn towards Sitting Bull's camp. I saw a great dust rising. It looked like a whirlwind. Soon a Sioux horseman came rushing into camp shouting, "Soldiers come! Plenty white soldiers!" So Two Moon ordered the Cheyenne warriors to get their horses, and then told the women to take cover away from the teepee village. I rode swiftly towards Sitting Bull's camp. Then I saw the white soldiers fighting in a line. Now this was Reno's men. And Indians covered the flat. They began to drive the soldiers all mixed up. Sioux, then soldiers, then more Sioux, all shooting. The air was full of smoke and dust. I saw the soldiers fall back and drop into the riverbed like buffalo fleeing. That's what Two Moon had said. Now the war chief who rallied the Indians and turned back Reno's attack was a muscular, full-chested, 36-year-old Hunkpapa named Pizee, or Gall, G-A-L-L. Gall had grown up in the tribe as an orphan. While still a young man, he distinguished himself as a hunter and a warrior, and Sitting Bull adopted him as a young brother. Some years before, while the commissioners were attempting to persuade the Sioux to take up farming as a part of the Treaty of 1868, before they knew there was gold in the Black Hills, Gall went to Fort Rice to speak for the Hunkpapas. "We were born naked," he said, "and have been taught to hunt and live on game. You tell us that we must learn to farm now, live in one house, and take on your ways. Suppose the people living beyond the Great Sea should come and tell you that you must stop farming and kill your cattle and take your houses and lands. What would you do? Would you not fight them? And so in the decade that followed that speech, nothing changed Gall's opinion of the white man's self-righteous arrogance. And by the summer of 1876, he was generally accepted by the Hunkpapas as Sitting Bull's lieutenant, the war chief of the tribe. Now, Reno's first onrush caught several women and children in the open. The cavalry's flying bullets virtually wiped out Gall's family. It made my heart bad, he told a newspaperman some years later. After that, I killed all my enemies with the hatchet. His description of the tactics used to block Reno was equally terse. Sitting Bull and I were at the point where Reno attacked. Sitting Bull was big medicine. The women and children were hastily moving downstream. The women and children caught the horses for the bucks to mount them. The bucks mounted and charged back Reno and checked him and drove him into the timber. And this was written, this quote of his was for a newspaper I once worked for, the St. Paul Pioneer Press out of Minnesota. And this was the July 18th, 1886 edition. So it was 10 years afterward. And I worked for that paper as an art director back in the 1990s. So in military terms, Gall turned Reno's flank and forced him into the woods. He then frightened Reno into making a hasty retreat, which the Indians quickly turned into a rout. The result made it possible for Gall to divert hundreds of warriors for a frontal attack against Custer's column, while Crazy Horse and Two Moons struck the flank and the rear. Meanwhile, Pete-San-Wastewin and other women had been anxiously awaiting the Long-Haired soldiers across the river. I could hear the music of the bugle, and I could see the column of soldiers turn to the left to march down to the river where the attack was to be made. Soon I saw a number of Cheyenne ride into the river, then some young men of my band, then others, until there were hundreds of warriors in the river and running up into the ravine. When some hundreds had passed the river and gone into the ravine, the others who were left, still a very great number, moved back from the river and waited for the attack, and I knew the fighting men of the Sioux, many hundreds in number, were hidden in the ravine behind the hill upon which Longhair was marching, and he would be attacked from both sides. And this was the a quote of Pete-San-Wastewin. And this appeared in McLaughlin's work. Now, Kill Eagle, a Blackfoot Sioux chief, later said that the movement of Indians toward Custer's column was like a hurricane, like bees swarming out of a hive. Hump, the Minneconjou comrade of Gall and Crazy Horse, during the old Powder River days, said that the first massive charge by the Indians caused the long-haired chief, Custer, and his men to become confused. The first dash the Indians made, my horse was shot from under me, and I was wounded, shot above the knee, and the ball came out at the hip. I fell and lay right there. Crow King, who was with the Hunkpapas, said, "The greater portion of our warriors came together in their front, and we rushed our horses on them. At the same time, warriors rode out on each side of them, and they circled around them until they were surrounded." Now 13-year-old Black Elk watched from across the river, and he could see a big dust whirling on the hill, and then horses began coming out of it in empty saddles, with empty saddles on them. And so he watched this happening, and the smoke of the shooting and the dust of the horses out the hill shut out the hill, Pete-San-Wastewin said. And the soldiers fired many shots, but the Sioux shot straight, and the soldiers fell dead. The women crossed the river after the men of our village, and when we came to the hill where there were no soldiers living, and Longhair, Custer, lay dead among the rest. The blood of the people was hot, and their hearts bad, and they took no prisoners that day. And this was her quote from McLaughlin's as well. So Crow King said that all the soldiers dismounted when the Indians surrounded them. They tried to hold on to their horses, but as we pressed closer, they let go their horses. We crowded them toward our main camp and killed them all, and kept in order and fought like brave warriors as long as they had a man left. According to Red Horse, toward the end of the fighting with Custer, these soldiers became foolish, many throwing away their guns and raising their hands, saying, "Sioux, pity us, take us prisoners." And the Sioux did not take a single soldier prisoner, but killed every single one of them. None were alive for even a few minutes. That's what Red Horse said. And that was his quote as it was written, I believe, in the McLaughlin article as well. No, this was according to the U.S. Bureau of American Ethnology, the 1888 edition. And so long after the battle, White Bull of the Minneconjou drew 4 pictographs showing himself grappling with and killing a soldier identified as Custer. Among others who claimed to have killed Custer were Rain in the Face, Flat Hip, and Brave Bear. Red Horse said that an unidentified Santee warrior killed Custer. Most Indians who told of the battle said they never even saw Custer and didn't even know who killed him. "We didn't know till the fight was over that he was the white chief," Low Dog said. In an interview given in Canada a year after the battle, Sitting Bull said that he never saw Custer, but that other Indians had seen and recognized him just before he was killed. He wasn't hard to miss. He was wearing a blue shirt, a placketed shirt with wide, broad white trim on it, and the big collar, and it had a star on each side, and he had a long, flowing red bandana, or red scarf, that he wore, and a huge brimmed hat that was kind of off-white in color. That's how he rode out into battle that day, the cockiness of Custer. Now, he did not wear his hair long as he used to wear it, Sitting Bull said. It was short, but it was the color of the grass when the frost comes. So where the last stand was made by Custer, the long hair stood like a sheaf of corn, with all the ears fallen around him. But Sitting Bull did not say who killed Custer. That was his eyewitness of Custer, that he stood there as a sheaf of corn with all the ears dropped. But he didn't say who killed him. An Arapaho warrior who was riding with the Cheyennes said that Custer was killed by several Indians. He was dressed in a buckskin coat and pants and was on his hands and knees. He'd been shot through the side, and there was blood coming from his mouth. He seemed to be watching the Indians moving around him. 4 soldiers were sitting up around him, but they were all badly wounded. All the other soldiers were down. Then the Indians closed in around him, and I did not see any more. Now the buckskin, by the way, this is what he would wear, and he'd take off that buckskin. He had that blue shirt. So I've also heard accounts where it said he was dressed in his buckskins with all the trim dangling and all of that. And they said he was shot in the hip, and first, and he went down, and he was bleeding from the mouth. He had internal wounds as well, and that he was down on hands and knees, just watching what was going on around him when he was killed. And the Indians closed in around him, because there was no one left alive other than him on that little hilltop. And it wasn't even a hill. They weren't on the top of the hill. They were on a slope going down from the hill. So regardless of who had killed him, the long hair who had made the thieves' road run into the Black Hills was dead with all his men. Reno's soldiers, however, reinforced by those of Major Frederick Benteen, were dug in on a hill farther down the river. The Indians surrounded the hill completely and watched the soldiers throughout the night. The next morning started fighting them again, and during the day the scouts sent out by the chiefs came back with warnings of many more soldiers marching in the direction of the Little Bighorn. And after a council it was decided to break camp, and the warriors had expended most of their ammunition, and they knew it would be foolish to try to fight so many soldiers with only bows and arrows. And so the women were told to begin packing, and before sunset they started up the valley toward the Bighorn Mountains, the tribes separating along the way and taking different directions. And when the white men in the east heard of the long-hair Custer's defeat, they called it a massacre, and they went crazy with anger. Do you see this as a massacre? No, they were attacking, and they were rebuffed, and they were defeated. They didn't want people to know this. They wanted to punish all the Indians in the West now because of this. Because they could not punish Sitting Bull and the war chiefs, the great council in Washington, Congress, decided to push the Indians they could find, those who remained on the reservations and had taken no part in the fighting. On July 22nd, the great warrior Sherman, this is less than a month after the Little Bighorn, received authority to assume military control of all reservations in the Sioux country and to treat the Indians there as prisoners of war, even though they were not there in this battle. On August 15th, the Great Council made a new law requiring the Indians to give up all rights to the Powder Country and the Black Hills. They did this without regard to the Treaty of 1868, maintaining that the Indians had violated the treaty by going to war with the United States. This was difficult for the reservation Indians to understand because they hadn't attacked the United States soldiers at all. They didn't even know what was happening when it happened. Nor had Sitting Bull's followers attacked them until Custer sent Rito charging through the Sioux villages. So to keep the reservation Indians peaceful, the Great Father sent out a new commission in September to cajole and threaten the chiefs and secure their signatures to legal documents that transferred the immeasurable wealth of the Black Hills to white ownership. And several members of this commission were old hands at stealing Indian lands, notably Newton Edmonds, Bishop Henry Whipple, and the Reverend Samuel D. Hinman. And at the Red Cloud Agency, Bishop Whipple opened the proceedings with a prayer, and then Chairman George Manypenny read the conditions laid down by Congress. Because these conditions were stated in the usual obfuscated language of lawmakers, Bishop Whipple attempted to explain them in phrases which could be used by the interpreter. And we've got to end there, and we'll pick this up on Monday of next week to finalize the loss of the Black Hills. You see what they did? They waged war, didn't call it war. The Indians waged war back and won. And for this now, the United States was going to confiscate all lands in the Black Hills, which was what they wanted in the first place, and all the Powder River country where Red Cloud had gone with his people as a result. And this was their justification. More on this. We'll see you Sunday morning right here for It's Sunday at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time. And you guys have a good weekend. We'll see you later.